I was working at the Detroit News Bureau in Lansing, covering state government, primarily state courts and legal issues in the legal system. And when the strike began, I walked off the job, as did most reporters who were represented by the Newspaper Guild. I was on the picket line for a few weeks, picketing the printing plant and distribution center in Brighton. But a couple of weeks into the strike, on the way home from Brighton to Lansing, our car was hit by a drunk driver. So I was in the hospital. Other strikers in the car were injured to different degrees, and I didn't picket after that. I had been an adjunct at the MSU Journalism School for about 5 years. Before that, teaching news writing and magazine writing courses. And the first year of the strike, I was still an adjunct and freelancing full-time. And then after a year, I joined the faculty full-time. So the strike was responsible for my joining the faculty full-time, but I had been affiliated with the J School and teaching before the strike.
I also want to get a sense of where your stance was and how you felt about the strike and the issues surrounding it.
From my perspective, the strike was not driven by the needs or demands of the reporters and photographers and other journalists represented by the Newspaper Guild, but was driven primarily by the Teamsters, the largest union in the coalition. The Teamsters drove the trucks and made the deliveries, and that union was most concerned about job security. So all the unions walked out together. As reporters at that time, I don't think we worried about job security. That was when the newspaper industry was still strong, and when both parent companies, Gannett, which owned the Detroit News where I worked, and Knight Ridder, which owned the Free Press, were making money. At least nationally, they were doing quite well. So in terms of would I or would the Newspaper Guild alone have gone on strike over what we wanted, which were additional salary or benefits? Probably not. But because we were allied with and negotiating with the other unions, it was an all for one, one for all situation.
Was it odd that in many ways the newspaper was becoming part of the news?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation when that happens. It doesn't happen only in labor situations, but I'll give you a couple of other examples from my own career. When I joined the Detroit News in 1984 in the Lansing Bureau, we were owned by a privately held company, mostly family. And then Gannett bought the News, and Gannett and Knight Ridder applied to the U.S. Justice Department for approval for a joint operating agreement. And in that kind of agreement, the business functions of the two newspapers would be handled jointly. So things like circulation and advertising, handling financial matters, and then the news sides would still remain separate. Well, the two companies had opposition ran into opposition from unions and local political and community leaders over the plan. And there was litigation. So I had to cover some of the legal disputes and the decision by a federal appeals court that let the JOA proceed. So that was strange because your bosses, and at least the bosses of the bosses, the high level of management, had a big stake in what the court did or didn't allow. and the owners of the companies, which were both publicly held, had a big stake. So the stories that reporters wrote about that controversy came under a different kind of scrutiny than reporters normally undergo when they're writing on crime or government or health or environment. Second situation is that I have not been involved in personally, but I know what the situation is when your news organization is being bought, is being shut down, is merging, or one of your competitor news organizations is being bought or shut down or merging. So it's an unusual situation for reporters there because they're reporting in a sense about their own future, either directly because they work for a TV station that's getting purchased, or they're working for an opposing TV station that might get a bigger or smaller market share depending on what the new owners of the first station do. And the strike is the same way, except that it was even more bitter because of the tensions between management, so your editors, and the rank and file workers on the one hand, but also between the strikers who stayed off the job and their former colleagues who crossed the picket line and continued to work. And then the third kind of tension was between the strikers and the scabs, the outsiders who were hired to replace the striking workers. So there were some confrontations on the picket lines between various groups of people in those categories.
I was also hoping that you could tell me a little bit about the environment of the Detroit News leading up to the strike.
I can tell you a little bit, but probably not a lot, because I worked in Lansing and I spent little time in the newsroom in Detroit. Actually spent as little time as I could, because what I had to do, I was covering either out of Lansing or outstate. So I might go to Grand Rapids or to the UP on particular stories. So I usually was in Detroit only for meetings or if I had a particular story there. And I didn't hang out in the newsroom, and then at the end of the day, I didn't go out drinking with the other reporters or socializing, because I got in the car and drove an hour and a quarter, hour and a half back home. So I can't talk much about details, except I can talk a little bit about the last minute before the strike, relative last minute decision by management to all of a sudden do performance evaluations for all the reporters. This was a process that the union had serious qualms about because of the favoritism that kind of evaluation normally takes, but also because, although it apparently had been policy for a while, nobody did it. And then all of a sudden, editors were told that they had to evaluate their employees' performance, and there was suspicion among and that raises would be dependent, at least in part, on the performance evaluation. So among the concerns were that management would then use these last-minute evaluations to make decisions that it didn't negotiate in terms of pay for reporters. A second was that it would be used to criticize reporters and photographers and copy editors without an adequate chance for them to review what their bosses said. And third of all, there was concern because it was all rushed that editors wouldn't have time to do a fair and comprehensive evaluation, particularly in the newsroom where editors and reporters change beats fairly frequently. And there were a number of reporters who were being evaluated by someone they had worked with for just a few weeks or a few months. And those were editors who didn't have time to look back at, say, the previous year's worth of clips to get a full sense of what that reporter's performance had been. So that's the piece I'm most familiar with and the concerns that the members of the guild had about the way that policy was implemented and the way it was rushed through.
You said you were briefly on the picket line.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could describe some of your experiences on the picket line.
Yeah, you know, at the beginning, particularly since I wasn't in Detroit for the picketing, I may have, I can't remember whether I went there once, maybe, but it was a different setting because this was just a sort of a printing distribution center. So the only people going out and in were drivers who then either, whether they had crossed the picket line or were newly hired. So I never saw anybody I knew. I never saw any of my editors or my editors' editors or other reporters. So it wasn't like outside the Free Press or the news building in Detroit where people you worked with a week ago are crossing the picket line and you're on the outside. So it was, and most of the strikers who were picketing in Brighton were drivers, and they weren't the journalists, and a lot of them lived closer to Brighton than to downtown Detroit, which is why they chose to picket there. And in some ways it was kind of festive. It was the summertime, so the weather was good. The trucks would drive in or out and people would yell and scream and maybe bang on the side of the truck and shake their fists. But it wasn't the personal, physical interaction that happened in Detroit. So if you were on strike and you wanted to get strike benefits, you had to do a certain amount of work, a certain number of hours connected with the strike to get your strike benefits from the union. So it was not that the people who were there were necessarily, they were generally not leaders of the unions, in that they weren't members of the executive committee or the negotiating committee, and they were there pretty much to do their